So when I spoke to Baba OJ, I actually asked him, in hindsight, I now realize, a very rude question, and it was just pure ignorance on my behalf. I was this little, young white Dutch girl, from the Netherlands. I did not really understand racism the way you guys
Uh-huh.
did. And I asked him, I'm like, why are you guys always going on about being black? Why is that such a big issue? Now, at the time, he could have chosen to be offended. He could have talked
Yeah.
down to me like, oh, you stupid little girl, but he didn't. He very calmly spoke to me, and it changed my perception completely, because he explained to me that with American history, even to this day,
Yeah.
slavery only ended at this moment less than 160 years ago. And then
Facts.
after that, there was still the Jim Crow law
The
that
Trim
went on
Crow
for another
era.
100 years. A whole lot of segregation,
Hmm.
where white and black people would have different bathrooms, different drinking fountains, sit in different
Yes.
parts of the bus. And even though I'd heard about that, and I heard about, Rosa Parks and stuff, when I spoke to Baba Ojo, it really touched me, because I think as well he told me that it was either his grandparents or his great grandparents who still had known slavery, right, or had been slaves.
Yes. His
And that was
grandparents.
like,
Hmm.
that was insane, that to me at that moment,
Yes.
to talk to a living person whose
Yes.
grandparents had been slaves. And that's when it struck me. I'm like, this is not ancient history. This
No,
is like,
not at
this is
all.
quite recent.
Recent history. It is.
Yeah.
And if you could
Wow.
imagine the trauma. So, like, if you, and I hate to use this as an example, but if you imagine a woman who was raped as a child, and
Hmm.
what kind of trauma that presents to that woman for the rest of her life, even if she's able to move forward and able to
Right.
do wonderful things in her life, that trauma never leaves. Now, that's just a woman that's, let's say
Right.
she passes away at 80 years old, and let's say she was assaulted, when in her 20s. That's 60 years. But Black people's realities of slavery was hundreds of years. So this trauma was passed down generation to generation of those that never did see freedom, and even those that finally did see freedom from slavery. That trauma was still so baked in to our realities as a
Mm.
Black race of people in America that yeah, it's tough to define a world without seeing it through that lens for us, because so much of our realities were based on being Black and having racism shown to us because of it.
Yeah. And it is, and in a way, that is how the past kind of lives on, right? It kind of continues, because also parents, whatever traumas they have, they pass it to their children, who pass it to their children, who pass it to their children. And so it becomes also like this cycle that, of course, you guys to a large extent have also been wanting to break a lot of the cycles that were in place.
Yes.
How do you feel,
Yes.
actually, now looking back on it? I mean, you guys have achieved so much. We'll go into everything that you've achieved
Sure.
throughout the interview, but how do you feel, just from that point of view? Do you feel like you've managed to get your point across, and do you think it's made a difference, even just on a personal level, for certain people?
Yes, and yes. When I speak of trauma, the
Yeah.
trauma happens on all sides of the fence. So, in other words, it's trauma to Black
Yes.
people
Yeah.
who were the victims of slavery and oppression, but it's also trauma to white people who knew that this life that was being perpetuated was unnatural. It was evil. They saw
Yeah.
evils. Some of them participated in evils. And so these things are traumas for all people involved, and the nation as well, just as a
Hmm.
collective and spiritual whole, just as a country.
Yeah.
And so, yes,
Yeah.
I think the music has had a great impact on whites, Blacks, Latins, Asians, people who have heard it. And has it changed everything? Like, some people will say, well, things are
No.
still the same, or even some will say, well, things are even worse. But that's not the point of change. When you try to make a change, you're making the change for the people around you and the people that you can impact. What happens in the future, none of us have control
Right.
over. So I do know that the music
Yeah.
is and has made a big difference in millions and millions and millions of people's lives. So it's
Yeah.
something that we're proud of. And we continue to
Yeah.
make music to this day. So we even still continue that mission.